Welcome, everybody. If you don't want to have yourself recorded, I encourage you to take yourself off camera because we do plan to upload this to YouTube. Otherwise, of course, we do welcome all of your beautiful faces if you do want to be seen on camera for our YouTube series. So I'll start us off here by introducing myself. My name is Austin G. I am a former member of the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, as well as a longtime member of the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. I use he, him pronouns. And personally, I'm based out of the Fredericksburg DSA branch of Richmond, Virginia DSA. And to say that I'm extremely proud, happy, honored, excited to be your facilitator this evening would be an understatement, considering this is our first, although technically second, political education session of the 21st Century Socialism series, which is now being sponsored by our newly announced 21st Century Socialism Caucus. That's right, baby. We have brought it together. This is something that has been a long time coming. Louisa and I, Louisa, who is also on the call. In fact, I'll pivot to Louisa here to briefly introduce yourself before I go further into my spiel.
My name is Luisa Martinez, she, her pronouns. Just briefly, this has been a project Austin and I have been talking about for a really long time, starting a 21st Century Socialism Caucus, where we could just say whatever we want in support of the parties pursuing socialist projects around the world. And we really want to convey this idea to members in DSA that socialism is alive and well, and we have plenty to learn from these countries that are in the global South specifically, right? We both grew up poor, and so we also wanted to bring that perspective to DSA and make sure that it's centered. That's all.
Wonderful. That's right. Thank you very much there, Luisa, our comandante, as I affectionately like to refer to her, although she might reject that label. Yeah, once again, this has been a long time coming, right? Luisa and I first met each other in person in Caracas, Venezuela, technically, which was on the 250th anniversary, if I'm getting my years correct, of Venezuelan independence. That is the battle that secured Venezuelan independence. It was impossible to be there for those celebrations and to not have them have an enormous impact on myself, on Luisa, on the hundreds of attendees that were also there. The things that people of Venezuela have been able to achieve under their socialist experiment, as Luisa mentioned, there's so much we can learn from, right? And a lot of it is so very misunderstood within the United States. And that's another thing why our focus is political education, right? Teaching people about these projects, not only in Venezuela, but obviously in China, which we'll be discussing a lot about tonight as well. 21st century socialism itself was, of course, first espoused by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and is something that more people in the United States need to learn about, to read about. And once again, that's a big part of why we're bringing together all people who think like us within DSA, so we can engage in this critically important work. So, our tech overlords today, if you can help me out here, if you also support this mission and want to get involved, I encourage you to apply to join our caucus. Which, once again, our tech overlords will probably be DMing our participants here in a moment. Follow us on social media, which you should be getting that as well. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about the 21st Century Socialist Caucus a little bit later in our call. But we do have a guest today. We do have a wonderful, wonderful guest. And once again, seeing as political education around international socialism, international socialist projects is a major focus for us, we decided on none other than Tings Chak of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research to join us in a discussion regarding China, as well as what implementation of socialism has been like for them within the 21st century. 21st century. So, Tings, if you wouldn't mind briefly introducing yourself, so we can get started with our conversation.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Austin and Louisa, for inviting me. And it's a real honor to be part of the first or maybe the second 21st Century Socialist series. So exactly, my name is Tings Chak. I'm based here in Beijing. Um, I'm seeing a very, very bright and sunny blue sky day here in Beijing. I'm part of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, where I'm a researcher. I help coordinate some of the work we do here in Tricontinental Asia, as well as I'm a co-editor of the Wenhua Zhongheng Journal for Contemporary Chinese Thought, which I'll share a little bit with you all today on this question of the environment and ecological transition. But it's a real pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you again.
No, thank you, Tings. And once again, we do want to talk a lot about, or we plan to talk a lot about, ecology in China, the environment in China, especially since ecology is very important to us within the 21st Century Socialist Caucus. But I wanted to begin on what I would describe as a hot topic that's in the news, right? Before we get to ecology. Um, which also I should mention if during this conversation, if folks have any of their own questions, if you could please utilize the Q&A function in your chat, and we'll try to get to them as we conclude here. But the first question that I have is regarding tariffs, right? Tariffs. We're seeing them in the news. Donald Trump, right? Oh my goodness, don't we thoroughly dislike Donald Trump? I know I do. What has the response in China been like regarding the tariffs so far? And like obviously there's news every day about what is even being tariffed. Is that a verb? But yeah, what has the response in China been like so far regarding some of the tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to avoid this topic, right? Because it's the thing that's consuming a lot of our attention. So, I mean, of course, we've just been trying to keep up with the changes in the tariffs, since February, the first, the executive order on the 10% imports, to Liberation Day now, last account is 145%. So it's kind of hard to keep pace. And I think the government has been doing well, at least what is actually a reciprocal response in terms of putting tariffs back against US products, specifying some areas. And then I think it reached a point when when 145%, the Chinese government just said, okay, we're not playing this game anymore. Okay, we've left it at 125%. Whatever Trump is going to continue doing, this is clearly not going anywhere productive. There's nothing to be able to negotiate or benefit either side, and certainly hurting a lot of the people. I would say the people specifically, the working class and poor of the United States. In terms of responses, I would say obviously there. I said a little bit about the government's response. I think one of the other things, in addition to tariffs in kind, have been a pretty strong diplomatic response from the government, really challenging. When I'm quoting the government saying these unilateral bullying and coercive measures that we're seeing from Trump. And I think that's a pretty accurate term because it's not something that's just affecting China, even though there's a temporary reprieve for other countries in terms of the tariffs that were imposed. But I think this is something around, I think the US hegemony and its attitude towards other countries. Basically, we will tariff you, we will do what it became a verb, right? We will tariff you, we will do whatever we'd like. And you will, the only thing you can do is don't retaliate, and we'll see, if we can negotiate. I mean, that kind of attitude, I think, in 21st century, in 2025, isn't very acceptable, not only for, a strong and emerging economy such as China, but I think for many parts of the global South that has, dealt with this kind of really neo-colonial and imperialist attitude for hundreds of years. So I think for China to be able to stand up, as obviously not every global South country has the economic power or the political will to be able to do that, but it is important symbolically and for, I think, standing up to this kind of bullying and unilateral actions. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about how the Chinese people have been feeling. Obviously, huge country, 1.4 billion people. Contrary to what many people think, China is not one voice, it's many. But on the whole, these tariffs have really kind of united the country, united public opinion, because there's a very strong sense, and I would frame it as a kind of patriotism to say, no, we have to defend our national sovereignty. These are clearly aggressions that the people do not support. And just to get a sense, when the first Chinese countermeasures came after the Liberation Day, just in 1 week, the hashtag China's countermeasures arrived, got 180 million posts in just a week, so it's a highly debated discussion. This is on Weibo. It's like often compared to, China's X or Twitter. But anyway, I think one of the things is that, the sentiment is not only around, okay, we have to defend our national sovereignty against aggressions, but also an understanding that this kind of behavior is also having negative impacts for the US's own economy and for the people. And so this is something you see quite a lot also on Chinese social media. And ultimately, I think there's a sense that, well, since Trump is basically throwing out the rules of the game, the game that, in fact, this international order that was created by the US to maintain its interests, it's sort of out the window at this moment. That there is sort of a pride too that, okay, China's standing up as a global South country to these kinds of behaviors. So, anyways, just a few thoughts on a very hot topic that's ever evolving.
No, yeah, that is extremely fascinating. And I know I could literally just talk about this for hours. But kind of similarly related to this conversation, I did want to ask you something else. I did related to this, if you could discuss a little bit further. So I did see recently, I believe you actually authored a piece in Brazil de Fato, specifically around like Panama, right? And some of the rhetoric that Trump has had regarding Panama. Obviously, Latin America is very important to us, right? Like, and I feel like Panama has almost been like the epicenter of Trump rhetoric as far as fear mongering around China within this hemisphere. I don't know if you'd be able to talk a little bit about that and some of the of what that has looked like. And if anybody hasn't checked it out, I strongly recommend the Brazil de Fato piece. It's very interesting.
Yeah, also, I think I published a version in English in People's Dispatch too, if you wanted to share it afterwards. Because actually, how I got interested in the Panama question, not only the aggressions now, but trying to look at this longer history of how Panama and the Panama Canal has been part of not only the Monroe Doctrine and the sort of US imperialist strategy in the region, but also has a strong relationship with China and the founding of the PRC. I don't want to, do a whole talk on the Panama itself, but I think having that historical look helps us understand what are these sort of new imperialist aggressions and why Panama has become a hotspot. Of course, a lot of the rhetoric has been part of this new Cold War imposed on China, around saying China is basically controlling Panama and US is going to take it back, right? And that kind of attitude is also, quite paternalistic. I don't think I have to, say much about that. And what's interesting is that I had discovered also these photographs that made me interested in 1964. Remembering that in 1964 there was student uprisings in Panama to basically fight for the sovereignty of the canal for the Panamanian people, and many students were massacred. And in that moment, there was a very strong understanding that, oh, the fight in Panama is also linked to the national sovereignty and national liberation of other third world countries. And in China, there were millions and millions of people that took to the streets at that moment to defend the Panamanian sovereignty over the canal. And I thought that was an important moment to bring that sovereign solidarity, that moment of historical solidarity to the present, and also clarify a little bit what is the role that China is playing in Latin America, which is in deep contrast to how the US sort of strong arms countries into submission. But anyway, there's more in that article. If anyone wants to read, I'd be happy to share it with you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Once again, I consider myself the biggest Latin American history nerd buff everywhere you can imagine. And I didn't even know about some of this, right? Like the solidarity protests, as you mentioned, in China regarding the canal. So I strongly, strongly recommend people. I see our one of our tech overlords, I love you, Eric, posted the link in the chat. So shifting gears a bit here. So you did begin your introduction here regarding some of the work around ecology in China, right? And I know that is something that we wanted to make a huge focus of this conversation. Within, the 21st Century Socialism Caucus, within DSA broadly, right, within the left broadly, I would hope, right, ecology is, of course, very important to us. I know we specifically embrace, the South American concept of buen vivir, or sumak kause, as it's known in Quechua, which is typically translated to, good living or simple living, that being a life that is based on harmony with nature, right, rather than dominance over it. I was very struck by the story of Erhai Lake, right? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in Dali, which you linked, and maybe our tech gods can link that as well. And how it seemed to me like similar views toward nature kind of played a part in toward the efforts that have significantly improved the ecological situation over there. So I would just love to begin by asking you to just talk to us a little bit about what exactly occurred in at Erhai Lake. Erhai Lake.
Perfect. You're saying it perfectly. Maybe just I'll step back as just for a moment about why because the article that you mentioned is in this latest issue of the Wenhua Zhonghang Journal. We called it On China's Ecological Transition. So I think one of the things, I started with saying that, oh, there's a blue sky here in Beijing, because I think that's something I quite appreciate. The first time I came to Beijing, I'm from Hong Kong originally, but the first time I came to Beijing was 20 years ago. And remembering what Beijing looked like, the air pollution, the, many things that, was quite scary. And I think that became the image for many people in the world. Like 10 years ago, I think people here will remember the international headlines was around, the so-called air apocalypse in China. This image of, everything's gray and people are wearing like gas masks around and this bleak, Beijing skyline. And there was an idea that China's so-called economic miracle this was the environmental cost. It was the inevitable cost of that economic miracle. And there was an idea that, China had this industrial growth, but it came because there was lax environmental laws. And this was just the ugly side of the reality. I think living here has, and you see a much more dynamic thing happening. And that's why we want to bring this discussion through this publication. And I think one of the things that have been very, very important is this question of ecological restoration. After this period, 3 decades of rapid economic development, many things, many contradictions emerged that had to be dealt with. And I think that's one of the things we want to bring. How is China seeing its own contradictions, and how is it trying to restore those areas that have been damaged? So I'll talk a little bit more about Arhai. But I think the other parts of the issue that we want to bring is also what's next. You restore the forests, the desertification, the lakes, but that's just minimum program. What is this program for a transition into an ecological society? And that's where we comes in with lots of questions around, investments in, renewable energies, to a national plan about how to, create an ecological society. So the whole issue as a whole brings many of these perspectives. But today I'll just talk specifically on how the Arhai Lake is part of this restoration part. Just to give a little context, Dali is a prefecture in the Yunnan province, which is in the southwest of China. It borders Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, and shares a lot of the common history and culture there, and has a very, very ancient history. One of the things that's very interesting about this region is that it is probably one of the most ethnically diverse regions. In China, we have 56 ethnic minority ethnic groups, right? But most of us are Han, like myself. But here, the majority of the population actually from different ethnic minority groups, specifically the Bai people. So giving you a little bit of sense of just the culture there. And the lifeblood of that region is this Arhai Lake, and has always been that it's one of the largest freshwater lakes in the country, the seventh, if I remember correctly. But what happened in this period, especially after the opening up and reform period, is that the pollution became quite serious, based on a few things. One of them is obviously the importing of the industrial agriculture, or so-called the Green Revolution, that introduced all kinds of fertilizers, pesticides, the story we know the world over. But it was also mixed with several traditional methods of cattle grazing in the region right by the lake that, basically contributed to the eutrophication of the lake. So I think it's interesting because it brings elements that it's not that all traditional methods are necessarily ecological, and this is where the question of how sort of science and science-based governance, that I'll talk a little bit more about, is very unique to how China governs and sees these questions. It's also linked to the fact that, as the economy was improving, there was also more tourism. It's a very beautiful region that was, the tourism that was straining the natural resources of the region, and just the changes in demographics, such as, urbanization, more and more people leaving the countryside to the cities, and sort of the density of places. So that being said, already in the 90s, we were seeing huge problems in the lake. And there's many kind of piecemeal measures that were taken, motorized fishing boats, banning those, or banning some uses of, detergents that contain phosphorus, etc. But that didn't really, these piecemeal sort of policies didn't really deal with the problem. And so the moment that really helped change, I think, the perspective was in the 2000s, when China was really going through a process of seeing this environmental destruction and needing to come up with a plan, and the institutions to actually deal with it. And back then, there was a vice minister. His name is Pan Yue. He was the Minister of Environmental Protection, which was quite new at the time, and he was one of the youngest ministers ever. And he came in and basically introduced a very, very strong environmental assessment or impact assessment, infrastructure to be able to do that. He stopped huge projects that had been violating environmental laws, placed huge fines, and really set a standard on being basically tough on environmental crimes, let's call it that. And one of the things that I think he said that is so important is that, and I'm quoting him, he says, our current economic development model is unsustainable. And it's not only unsustainable, but environmental pollution has severely constrained economic growth. So that I think is a really important thing because there's always a sense that economic growth, especially for global South countries that are trying to emerge out of underdevelopment and a long history of colonialism and imperialism, is that it always has to have a cost to the environment. That's just it. You have to go through that process. You have to go through the coal. I mean, coal is still 50% of the energy sources here, but you have to go through that in order. It's kind of the stagism, right? But he was already reversing that notion. He was already saying that, okay, protecting the environment is not at odds with economic growth. In fact, it is a precondition for any extended, sustained economic growth. And then he went on to also say that any kind of social injustice leads to environmental injustice, and which also exacerbates any kind of social injustice, social disharmony. So these things are also have a social consequence, not just an environmental or economic consequence. And I think that more holistic view really informed some of the things that we saw later on in terms of how China dealt with our high lake. I also feel free at any time to sort of pause, stop me, ask questions because I might go on and on and on. Okay, great. So I think that maybe just to say how then this transforms sort of this kind of vision of, okay, we need to change our model of development to consider the environmental protection and that the environmental protection is part of economic development. We saw at that time then, we have the first sort of scientists basically being dispatched to the region to really go and study the situation. And at that time, there was a professor named Kong Hainan. He had just come back from Japan to study also similar types of practices. And he led a team to study the realities on the ground. And those findings ended up being sent as a report to the State Council, which is the highest governing body, to create what would be a national water pollution control and treatment project, with our high lake being a pilot. One of the things to understand how China does governance is usually it's a very experimental process because it's a large country. Every part of the country has different conditions. So usually there's pilot in one place, test, see how it is, see if you can test it in another region, see if those lessons, and then maybe you might come with a national plan. That's just how everything has been done. Very scientific approach, I would say. And so in that, they were able to find out many, many things about the sources of pollution in a much more comprehensive way, a lot to do with agricultural practices, really on the ground types of work, so that the science is informing whatever policy decisions get made on the top. What I think is so interesting about these is that, Kong Hainan is not just a university professor. He's not just a scientist. He's also, a cadre. He's a member of the Communist Party of China. He is there also with a political mission and political task. I think this is something very specific to the, socialism with Chinese characteristics is that first and foremost is being led by a party, a Communist Party. And so when Kong Hainan wasn't just there to sort of study soil samples, water samples. He was also there doing the grassroots mobilizing work. He was there working with the local government, but also talking to the local peasant farmers, talking to the local sort of governing bodies, talking to teachers and doctors and media, informing, educating around, many of the things that, to be honest, takes time. It's not, you can't just, as contrary to, I think, what a lot of people in the West think, you can't just rule with an iron fist. You have to bring people along and build a kind of consensus, because it's saying, okay, for example, you're going to tell someone who runs a guest house, for tourism, and saying, no, you can't do that. What you're doing is actually harming because you're throwing, say, your wastewater directly into the lake, or telling, garlic producers there. It's a very important agricultural product, that, your methods that you've been doing for hundreds of years is actually polluting the lake that is the, lifeblood of this entire community. This is not easy stuff for people to accept necessarily. It takes time. You have to be there on the ground, convincing people, educating people. And so that, I think that aspect I want to bring is this building of consensus is really essential. To convince people that they need to make personal changes in their lives that might even mean in short-term sacrifices. For example, many of the inns had to be moved from the water's edges to areas. Clearly, they were also constructed by the government with compensation, et cetera. But most people don't want to leave their inns, on that edge, like lakeside properties, where they've been running a business. This is something that you have to kind of pull the entire community, mobilize the entire community, the business sectors, the entrepreneurs, to the, obviously run, really led by the party, mechanisms, but also, as I said, the scientists, to the, public sector. All of that has to be brought in to the fold. So another thing I think was quite interesting in terms of how that kind of grassroots work happens, especially around scientists, is that we got to learn about the what's called the Science and Technology Courtyard model, which is run by the China Agricultural University, which is the largest and main agricultural university in the country, where they basically set up these sort of study hubs in the villages, in the communities, where graduate students could go and not just, sort of parachute in, but you're actually going there to live with people, understand the issues, understand the problems, understand the production methods, and try to collectively come up with solutions that would actually work, because people are being convinced that this is something that, they can maintain their, incomes, they can still produce effectively, that there are also ecological alternatives to, for example, fertilizers and pesticides that can yield, or if not even more than what they had been doing. That takes, basically living, working, sleeping, being amongst the people. And that's, I think, a very, very particular way, I think, of a socialist characteristic of how even scientists engage in this kind of mobilization work. And I think, we can talk a bit more. I'm not sure what areas we wanted to go more into, because each one of these, I think we could, speak a little bit to. But I would say overall, the Arhai example tells us three things that I think are important. One is that how does a higher level central government environmental vision get decentralized on the ground into grassroots local practices, and the kind of innovations that have to be done, because every locale has its own characteristics. The second is, and I can't emphasize enough, is the importance of science-based governance. I think more and more, as we're seeing both in the United States or other places with the rise of the far right around the world, there is an attack against science. There's an attack against scientific thinking. There's an anti-intellectualism. And that, I think, is really important to fight against. And this we want to emphasize that. How does science really inform practices? And the third is this capacity to mobilize across sectors of society under this common objective to resolve a very complex and difficult issue, such as one of the largest lakes in China, restoring it to, excellent water quality from, just a few years ago, it was literally unfit for human contact. So I think I'll stop there. We can open up for more questions and see which areas we want to dive into. Oh, maybe I'll just say one more thing. Sorry. I think that the significance of this isn't just for China. When we're here, talking about the environment, we know that, climate change, climate catastrophe is surely an international question. It's not a Chinese question. Only thing that's worthwhile to study this is also what can be learned for other regions and other struggles. And I think one of the things is that now, as we're seeing, the decline, especially around West, and on this leadership on the, climate question, I think it's really, with Trump coming back, it's quite scary for the planet, right? You will know very well from, climate change is a hoax, to pulling out of the Paris Agreement to drill, baby, drill. I mean, this is contrary, completely contrary to what the planet and what humanity needs right now. So we really hope that some of these experiences and some of the really, I think, drastic shifts in direction for China too, from hard-earned lessons, it's still going to be a very long process. It's still a developing country that has to overcome many, many kind of questions of development and industrialization. But it's something I think we as leftists have a lot we can learn from, and hopefully that's useful for everyone in this room today.
So thank you so much for that. Right. That's so much to take away from that and so many different follow-up questions that I'd love to ask. Before I do though, once again I encourage people, we linked it in the chat. I encourage people to read the full piece, right? It's so fascinating, so interesting. I know I definitely learned a lot. But one follow-up question I did have before I pivot to some of our Q&A questions from the audience, which if anybody in the audience does have questions, please utilize your Q&A function and we will try to get as many as we can. Um, I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more on how important China's example of central planning has been, right, for this. I think one of the reasons I ask that is because I think in the U.S. is also very misunderstood, right, how central planning actually manifests itself materially. And you did touch upon this a little bit just before in your intervention, but I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think um, not only when I was sharing with Pan Yuan his sort of vision already in 2007 around having to find a different model of development that considers the environment as a core component part, not just a afterthought. I thought already in that same moment, actually, Xi Jinping was not the president yet. You know, he was governing a province, and he had already started putting forward some ideas. Things don't translate very well into English, but it's something like, you know, lush mountains and green waters. But that became, you know, a kind of vision of saying that, okay, you know, economic prosperity as well is based off of the fact of protecting these lush forests and green waters. Green sounds bad, but in Chinese it sounds beautiful. It sounds like, oh, there's some algae in the water you have to take care of. But anyway, so that was already coming into place, you know, 15 years ago. But of course, when he came into the presidency, that became one of the rallying cries around how to think about the environment. And then later on formulated into what's called the ecological civilization. But of course, that's just a high level, you know, very high level vision. You know, that's not a policy per se. And I think how that translates, Arhai is a good example, and now is a used as a pilot model for many other regions since then of a practical, you know, solution. But of course, when you actually go, and we did a lot of studying as the Tricontinental, also in other campaigns, such as the poverty alleviation campaign that eradicated the extreme poverty, helped take the last 100 million people out of extreme poverty in the country. Same style. You have this national vision of saying we need to eradicate extreme poverty. We have a goal, we have a timeline. How it happens on the ground is very decentralized. And this is something I think people don't see because they have a sense that, oh, China's authoritarian. It's just there's a central, you know, central command and everyone just has to do. But how do you actually realize that? It has a lot of flexibility, a lot of, let's say, on the ground grassroots democracy that actually takes place. And we did a study called Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty, about 4 years ago. And I also recommend if anyone wants to read it, in that piece, you really get a better sense of how, again, that central planning gets brought down to the grassroots local levels, especially in the countryside where we've been focusing a lot of our research. I hope that answers a little bit of your question.
No, that definitely does. That's super interesting, right? And part of the reason I asked that is once again because of the way I guess how differently things are done in the United States and in the West, right? How the incapability to engage in any sort of long-term planning or long-term thinking clearly significantly hampers any actual attempts to fight ecological disaster, right? And especially specifically touching upon the U.S. framing of what central planning looks like in China that you mentioned there, right? Like people in the United States insist on looking at things as totally black and white, right? It's either this or that, when obviously there are many shades of gray, but we're all proper Marxists here, right? So we knew that. So going to this, so once again, thank you so much for all of that, Tings. So going to the chat here, let me see what wonderful questions we have from the group here. Okay, I see a great question here. So curious, Tings. So question from the chat. I'm joining the call from Cuba. Shout out to whoever is joining the call from Cuba. And I've been very interested in that China is partnering with Cuba to build full photovoltaic capacity. The US uses the blockade to induce blackouts here, which I've experienced while being here. Very sad. And I wonder if you could speak to how renewable energy both benefits the environment, but also the sovereignty of countries like Cuba to create energy domestically that is much more resilient against US imperialism. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, thank you to the comrade from Cuba. As you can see, I have my uh, always close to heart. So no, I mean, yes, I think we've been following very closely the blackouts and the causes, obviously, from the blockade, the criminal blockade from the last 6, 7 decades. And so I'm happy to see that the Chinese government has been collaborating um, on the question of photovoltaic and renewable energies on the island. It's one thing that I think, in fact, that's something that we want to focus on the issue is that, okay, restoring, but then what is this transition? What is the investments that need to be made in alternatives? Um, of course, I had mentioned China as a developing country still heavily relies on coal, but at the same time has made some really, really strong commitments around reaching carbon peak by 2030 and then carbon neutrality by 2050. These are very, very strong statements for a country so big that still is trying to figure out how to sort of de-addict itself from fossil fuels. One of the things we've been seeing, of course, is the huge investments in renewable energy sector, both in the technologies, advancing the technologies, and also applying those technologies. And just to give a sense is that just in last year, in 2024, the total combined solar and wind power that was actually installed in China represented two-thirds of the world's projects. So two-thirds of the world's, new investments and projects in these renewable sectors is in China. That means that also there's a huge jump in all of the, capacities, technologies, know-how, and I think we're going to see much more of that development in moving forward. This has also been applied to, obviously electric vehicles, which is so ironic. I think that we're seeing, this tariff war, this trade war targeting so much a sector that we need to develop, which is such as electric vehicles. Of course, last year, China, broke the record to produce 10 million electric vehicles, and many cities already. One of the things, if you ever get to visit China, is that you can hear how silent the cities are because there's already been such a transition to, the public transportation, the buses being all electrified, the cars on the street are electrified. This is also because it's been highly supported by the government, subsidies for people. There's the infrastructure also around the charging stations all around the country to make it viable. So this is also something, it can't be just, okay, here's a let's say one private company developing electric vehicles. It has to be part of a larger ecosystem supported by the central government to make that viable. And you can see, even if you're in a small town in the countryside, you will see these kinds of infrastructure and technologies already being there. It's not just something that you see in the main cities, but that takes central planning. And so in the issue as well, we have one article, very, very interesting, about the development of the electric vehicle industry. And it says a lot about how China plans and implements. And basically, in a way, sort of bypassed, not bypassed, but kind of skipped some of the development in the combustion engine or fossil fuel based cars towards already thinking about the future. And I think that's something quite exciting, lots to learn from, and I think can reveal some things about the socialist nature of how China governs.
No, that is so fascinating. We love our socialist to socialist solidarity, right? We love China. We love Cuba. So another kind of fun question here, if we have time for maybe a couple more questions here. Another fun question here, or at least I'd look at it as a fun world to live in. So Tings, in your mind, is it possible that China will overcome the US as the new superpower? Do you see the end of US empire near? So I guess that's kind of like a hypothetical one. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we know that China has been catching up to the US in many ways, right? If you look at the economic side, China is already the largest economy if you take into consideration purchasing power parity. We see already, production, not only in terms of, the just pure, GDP, but we're talking about the production force is already in China. 30% of the manufactured goods in China. A lot of this trade war is really about that. It's not only about, there was a moment, I think, and I think this has a lot to do with the kind of sort of imperialist attitude of the US, is that it was very okay with China sort of producing, those knockoff sneakers, or, those things that, the things that fill up dollar stores or whatever it was. But the moment it starts to move up the productive chain, in areas such as artificial intelligence to, semiconductors, that's when it's not okay. That's when it's, an existential threat for the US. But okay, we have that aspect. I think when we look at, for example, using Samir Amin, who helped us understand about how does hegemony maintain itself through this 5 controls, monopoly controls, right? So in a way, that economic aspect, yes, has been challenged by China's rise. But there are also other aspects that we cannot underestimate, which is the US military. China has no ambitions. Of course, it has a strong military, mostly defensive in nature, you can talk about the one military base it has in Djibouti that, mostly helps to ensure sort of trade routes are running smoothly, compared to 902 bases that the US has. In fact, we launched a publication just last year called Hyper-Imperialism, a Decade and New Stage. And I think we really detail in that to help us understand, it's easy for left to say, okay, the end of imperialism is near, or that, oh, maybe China is a competing imperialist power because it's strong in this way and that way. But we also need to have pretty accurate and informed assessment of what are the pillars, these like, say, 5 controls that form of US imperialism. And is China trying to be those things? Absolutely not. It has no international ambition to be an equal or do the same things that the US does in terms of its military might. We can talk about the other aspects too, whether it's control over natural resources, communications. I think communications is one thing. It's very clear that, in this new Cold War, the US hegemony over, the means of communication, the narratives around, control of the platforms where most of the world consumes their media is very much dominated in the hands of the US. So there's many areas that China is very, very, very far from contesting in a real way. But on the economic level, yes, absolutely. But I would say also China might have a strong economy, the productive capacity, but it doesn't control the international financial instruments. We know how much that has been weaponized, whether it's through, we were talking about Venezuela and Cuba, how much those, tools are used to basically suppress a country, whether it's through weaponizing the SWIFT system, whether it's weaponizing of the dollar. So these things, there's no comparison. And China neither has the political will to be a replacement of the US. It is also, I think, not contesting in those areas where US imperialism has its fangs most strongly embedded.
Thank you so much for that, Tings. I know that I definitely look forward to the Chinese century, so manifesting over here. So one last question here from the chat before we begin to move toward wrapping up here, as we are close to the hour mark. So this is a question that a lot of people, that I'm sure you see a lot, that a lot of people ask, so, and could prompt multiple hours conversation of itself. But let me see here. What is it? Oh yeah. So what do you say to people who say China is exploiting or doing soft colonialism in Africa?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. In fact, we had an issue last year, 2023, I guess, for the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative that's focusing on China, Africa. And there's some pretty good, interesting analysis around that. I think it links to questions about what is China's interests in the continent. And we also had a Grieve Chowa, who is a Zambian economist, also do a response to some of the scholars that were writing from China. So there's more there than I can say here. I think there's a couple of things, China and many African countries are really forged out of struggles for national liberation. There's a very, very strong sense of solidarity, of common, aspirations that have, I think, largely not been realized. And I think specifically for a lot of the African countries that have basically never been able to come out of colonialism because the neo-colonial structures just immediately impose itself, whether it's through the IMF, World Bank, debt, the debt crisis that immediately followed the independence, the formal political independence. That being said, of course, China has had a really important role in the continent. I mean, almost most African countries have now joined the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't have all that data with me, but amount of projects, especially around infrastructure that have critical infrastructure that have been built in the region. One of the things is, the African continent has something like $100 billion deficit on infrastructural deficit, just to be able to maintain, what it needs to build, let alone, large swathes of the continent don't actually have access to even electricity. So the infrastructure question is not just a sort of, oh, this is a diplomatic tool to win over African countries. It's a material question for, lives of working people. That being said, I think there are many questions that we can raise, especially around certain private companies. There are capitalist Chinese companies, even though China is not a capitalist society, and how a lot of these companies have behaved, whether through the mining sector. There's lots of issues around fishing. There's lots of questions about, especially legal mining in different regions. These things, I think, need to be cracked down on. I mean, and I think this is where the importance of a strong state pushed by a strong left is absolutely necessary. One that is able to assert its interests. Because one of the things is Chinese companies will buy what is being sold. And China will never, because of a non-interventionism, tell a country or try to even through military force impose a system or impose a leader or impose a kind of way of doing things. So that's really a big part of it, is how do African countries with, the African people really be able to get a better deal out of what is their national project, what is their national interests, what really helps advance and helps meet the needs of the people. I'm not putting all of that on them. I think that we as leftists, as Marxists, of course, we will always, defend the working class and defend the people around the atrocities that are done by any kind of private company. And so I think those things, I think, are very much something that we're studying a lot, and we have to pay a lot of attention. That being said, having, malpractices of companies or whatever it might be doesn't make China, big China, an imperialist force as a whole. And I think this goes back to the previous question around militarism, around interventionism, around a whole set of things that clearly China is not doing on the continent. So we have to kind of separate, be able to condemn the things, the malpractices and the things that are happening, but at the same time, not call everything colonialism, imperialism without a more scientific analysis.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Tings. One final question here, if you wouldn't mind, and I'm gonna use my facilitator privileges and ask this question. Sorry, Q&A, we're done with that. And so this is just a broad question, right, as we move to closing out here. And you can answer it as broadly or specifically as you'd like. Very simple. What do you think are some of the most important things the US, and in particular its socialist movement, can learn from China and its socialist experiment? Like I said, answer that however you would like.
Oh, it's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know if it's about learning from necessarily from China. I think that it's more of a maybe a kind of openness, I would suggest, in this time when we are seeing more and more escalation and polarization and many things that could be potentially dangerous, for humanity, not in our interests, for as the working people of the world, is to maintain a kind of interest and curiosity and openness about understanding China, and not necessarily using the kind of measuring stick of, say, a Western capitalist, liberal democracy as the only way to measure the world. And if without that, I don't think it's possible to even understand China. It's not even possible to understand that there are maybe other paths and sovereign paths of development that countries have fought for through liberation struggles, through revolutions, or through other means. Doesn't have to be. There's no, China is not exporting revolution right now. Maybe some of us wish, China was doing that, but it's not. But there should be a right to exist and coexist in this world system. And so I think I would just maybe it's more of an invitation than anything, because as long as we use that measuring stick to understand China, we will never, I think, be able to get to a deeper place and actually draw lessons from its very, very rich history, but it's also this incredible experimentation. I mean, if you just look, People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. My grandmother's, 20 years older than the revolution itself. So what it has been able to do from being the 12th poorest country in the world to become what it is today, there's so much to learn from. And it would be, I think, it would be doing us a great disservice to think that that is the enemy and that there's nothing that can be learned that can help forward our struggles wherever you might be.
Wonderful answer. Thank you so much, Tings. And before I formally close this out here, and of course give you, Tings, space to once again plug some of your work, I just wanted to thank the audience for its participation, right? This has been a wonderful discussion, and indeed the first, technically second, of many. And also wanted to just briefly remind folks, for anybody who's interested in learning more about the caucus specifically, to just remain on for a few minutes longer after we close our discussion, as we also want to provide space for some caucus updates, some of our next steps, and obviously space for anybody who might have questions for us. But Tings, thank you so much. Where can the people find you and your work?
Sure. You can find anything I talked about on the tricontinental.org. It's available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. You can find my name, Tings Chak, on X and other platforms. Write to me if you'd like. Always like to be in touch. So yes, thank you very much again.